Hi all, I'm Becky Bollinger, Climate Becky, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about wildfires in Colorado. Now, this summer has been pretty mild summer in terms of wildfire in Colorado, especially in terms of if you look elsewhere in the country with extraordinarily huge fires blowing up in California, the Pacific Northwest. And so what we've experienced here has actually been not too bad. And part of the reason for that is that we had a decent snowpack year. But we did have a couple of fires that people were very concerned about for good reason. They came into the wildland urban interface, the WUI, and there was a threat to people's homes. And so those get a lot of media attention. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk today is what are the biggest reasons that wildfires are changing in Colorado due to climate change? We all know that wildfires have been changing partially due to the way forests have been managed in the past. So we're talking about, giant forested areas where we practice complete wildfire suppression in the 80s and the 90s. And then we came to learn that wildfire is actually healthy for the ecosystems and for forests in terms of regenerating. And so now we're in this place where we've suppressed it so long that now we're getting these fires that blow up huge and uncontrollable because of the overmanagement that was done before. So that is one human-induced component to wildfires that we have to deal with now. But another big one is our changing climate. And climate change is having an impact on the way that we experience wildfires, particularly in Colorado. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those ways. The first and most obvious one that people think about is the early melting of our snowpack. And this is very valid because historically in Colorado, our peak wildfire season would start in June after the snow had melted and the ground start to dry out, and you're not getting much moisture in the way of storms in these mountain forest areas. And so you'd have that melting from the snow, and then it would dry out, and then everything would be nice and dry and ready for wildfires to pop up in June. And so think back to some of our big wildfires in the early mid 2000s, where we saw the Hayman fire, for example, in 2002, or the High Park fire in northern Colorado in 2012. And these took place in what you would climatologically consider to be our highest wildfire month, and that is June. And the reason that we saw those in June was due to drought that had occurred in the mountains the winter before. So there was an extremely low snowpack that accumulated in the mountains. And because that snowpack was so low that once the temperature started warming up, it melted super fast and it was gone really early. And so when you get that timing of snow melt and it's gone so much earlier than it normally is, now you're really drying things out. So by the time you get into mid-June, you are incredibly dry and you have a lot of kindling that's ready to go when you have an ignition or a spark. And so that is one of those most obvious ways that we can see climate change playing into this, because we know that a warming climate is going to impact our snowpack. We still get big snowpack years, but we also get low snowpack years. And so if you have a more frequency of lower snowpack years, or you start to see that they're melting a little bit earlier in general, you are increasing the risk for those wildfires simply because you're extending that summer season a little bit earlier and a little bit longer. And that increases the risk for June. So that's one of the most obvious ones. Drought is another one, and we know it's stated in the National Climate Assessment. It is stated in the Colorado Climate Change in Colorado report that we recently published back in the beginning of 2024, that drought is likely to increase in frequency and intensity in our state. We've already seen it in the earlier part of the 21st century, and we're going to continue to see that trend of we have more periods of time that we are in drought, and those droughts can get more severe because of warmer temperatures that suck moisture out of the ground and into the air. So that we do know has a big impact on wildfires, because while you don't have to have a drought to have wildfire, generally in Colorado, when we have our biggest wildfires, you will find that drought went along with it. So that's another big player. What I kind of want to talk about, though, is this third one, and the summers lasting longer. And this is something that we've really started to see in recent years that's becoming a big concern. And the reason for that is it's September 21st, or it's 22nd now. I'm wearing a sweater, but yesterday I was wearing a tank top. We're still getting temperatures into the 80s, and sometimes we can get temperatures in September into the 90s. Our summer is now extending further into what used to be fall. And it's also a drier time of year. So historically, in Colorado, we would see a monsoon season that would end sometime in August. So it would really ramp up in July and in August, and you would start drying out. But with that drying out, you'd also cool off, and all of your vegetation would nicely start going into dormancy. You'd be ready for your first snowstorm. You would not be talking about a risk of wildfire in September, October, November. And we're really seeing a change in that pattern in our state. One of the biggest examples that I can pull from is 2020. Literally big in terms of the East Troublesome Fire, for example, which happened in Rocky Mountain National Park over by Granby, and it even jumped the Continental Divide and started going down towards Estes. And this fire started in October. And for a fire of that size to happen in October, we had never seen before in our records. And so it was a huge concern of, why are we getting this summer-like wildfire activity and we're supposed to be in the middle of fall? And the reason is those warmer temperatures are carrying on later into the season. So you still have these warm temperatures, but you don't have any moisture. The memory of the monsoon season is long gone. So you get that really warm temperature anomalies. You're getting the really dry air, and you've further dried out your vegetation, which is maybe just going into dormancy, but still very dry and crackly. And we're also starting to get towards the windy season. Now, we're not talking winds like thunderstorm windy season. We're talking about those large scale that come along with the front and bring us those huge downsloping windstorms in the fall and winter months along the Front Range of Colorado. And when you get those, you're combining now warm air, dry conditions, and very windy conditions, all of which you have one spark in there or one ignition source in there, and now you can get a fire that quickly turns out of control. And that was what we saw with East Troublesome Fire, which I brought up. We also saw it with Cameron Peak Fire that same year. Even though Cameron Peak Fire started in August, they let it burn for a while because it was moving through a lot of areas with dead trees from the pine bark beetle infestation. And they kind of wanted that fire to go through there and get rid of some of that, those dead trees and all the litter. Unfortunately, once we got into September, the fire became really uncontrollable and had a major run right before Labor Day. And then again in October, actually the same day that the East Troublesome Fire started, Cameron Peak Fire had another huge run, and it was aided by all these things that we're not really used to seeing in October and November and things like that. The other obvious example to bring up is the Marshall Fire, which actually happened at the end of December. The interesting thing was this started after a summer and fall season that were record hot and record dry. So we went through the summer with extremely dry conditions. We went into the winter with extremely dry conditions. Those summer temperatures kept everything nice and warm, further contributed to drying out those soils and the vegetation. And all that came together during a major windstorm that was occurring on December 30th. And unfortunately, a fire had been started that then turned quickly uncontrollable and also turned into our biggest, most disastrous fire that we've ever seen. It wasn't the biggest, but it was big in terms of the most destructive, destroying the most properties that we had ever seen. And so these are the examples that we can see that we know that we've always had to worry about wildfires in the summer. In the spring, grass fires can be a big thing that you see, especially in drought years. You're going to see that higher frequency of grass fires happening on the eastern plains, especially on those very windy, downsloping windstorm days. But now we're starting to see more activity in the fall than what we've seen prior. And I think that this is something that we're going to have to expect to be a risk in our falls for quite some time now, because of the fact that those warmer temperatures are extending so much longer from summer and into fall. But we don't have that change in precipitation. So now we've left the monsoon season behind. We're waiting for that snow season to start. It's starting a little bit in the higher elevations, but not necessarily in the lower elevations. And then we start butting up against that windy season as well. And we're getting all those ingredients that are ideal for uncontrollable wildfires. And so that is something that I want to make sure that everybody keeps in mind as we go forward into this fall, officially starting this weekend today. Although I'm a climatologist, I really think it starts September 1st. That was historically, I don't think so anymore, because summer just feels like it lasts a lot longer now. But we had a fire in the last week. It wasn't a big one, but it was the Pearl Fire, which happened up just northwest of Red Feather Lakes in Larimer County. And there were a lot of evacuation notices that went out with that because of where people were living nearby. There was a lot of concern that it would cross over due to high wind activity into Wyoming. And it seems they've gotten a pretty good handle of it, which is great news. Earlier in this season, we had one, the Alexander Mountain Fire, which was just 6 miles due west of our house. And that one, they were also able to contain and did a really wonderful job with it. But the key is that these wildfires are not going anywhere. And there's only so much that you can manage beforehand, which there are actions to do to manage these. But what we as communities need to do is be aware of your surroundings. And there are so many communities on the Front Range of Colorado going all the way up to the Wyoming border and coming all the way down along the mountains and foothills, down through Denver, down to Colorado Springs, that these are areas that are part of the WUI. WUI is Wildland Urban Interface. It's not something that means just houses and towns that are in the middle of the mountains. It means where we have more densely populated regions, even suburban areas, up against these open space areas, wild grassland, forest lands. And so a lot of our neighborhoods, mine included, happen to fall in this wildland urban interface. And I want to point you to this latest release from the Colorado State Forest Service, where they have a wonderful map that shows you what the wildland urban interface looks like across Colorado. So you can kind of see where you line up in that with your general location. Ultimately, I want to end with We know that we get wildfires in the summer. Because of changing snowpack, it's more likely that we're at greater risk for those bigger wildfires in the summer months. And we know that we can get wildfires in the spring, particularly on the eastern plains, where we get those very high winds following climatologically dry winters. And so that is something that has been experienced for a long time. And now we have this new experience that we really need to remind ourselves of every fall. And that is to be aware of the conditions. When was the last time we got precipitation? How dry is the vegetation? How anomalously hot has it been? And so as long as we keep those in mind and we start preparing our homes, our neighborhoods, our communities for these types of events, we can hopefully minimize the risk of the destructive losses that might happen when a wildfire event occurs in that time period. So thanks all for joining me, and I will talk to you again next week.